You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Welcome to Unbiased Science, where we bring scientific method to the madness. I'm your host and public health scientist, Dr. Jess Steyer. And today I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Facciani, who I'll introduce in just one moment. Super excited to have Matthew. If it's okay, I'll call you Matthew just for the purpose of this chat. But we're going to chat all about misinformation. Matthew is really an expert on this topic. And as an aside, Matthew, I actually came to learn of you and your page via my husband, Ethan, who is fanboying out right now, but I'm having the opportunity to speak with you. We follow all your amazing content on social media, specifically on Threads, and he's always sending me links to your posts. I'm like, oh my God, this is so beautifully said. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, I'm going to read your bio now. And of course, let me know if I'm leaving anything out. Dr. Matthew Facciani is a social scientist who studies why people believe misinformation and what we could do about it. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame in the Computer Science and Engineering Department, where he develops and tests the effectiveness of media literacy tools. He has a book coming out next year called Misguided and regularly shares fantastic, and I mean fantastic, science communication via social media on Threads, Instagram. Where can people follow you, Matthew?
Threads is where I'm most active. I used to be more active on Twitter, but I've moved to Threads, as many people have recently.
Matthew, first, maybe I just want to take a step back for a sec, but what got you into this field of, this topic of misinformation? And I'm curious if you were in this field prior to COVID or if COVID really sparked the interest for you.
Yeah, so I've been interested in how beliefs form and why people think the way they do really since I was an undergraduate. So I've always been interested in how social influence changes beliefs and how that can even make us believe things that are not true. So I remember just even as a sophomore, my first research experiment was a modification of the Solomon-Asch conformity study, if you're familiar with that. So
I am, but can you share a little bit?
Yeah, so basically it's this study where as the participant, you go in this room and you're asked to evaluate the length of lines. So it's a really simple experiment or task where you see these different lines up on a wall and you have to say, okay, which one is the same length as the other line presented? And like 99% of the time, people get it correct. But whenever you're in this room with multiple other people that are actors and they are pretending to get the answer wrong in front of you, you then are much more likely to get it wrong yourself because you conform to the other people in the group. And I always thought that was so interesting, like how there's this purely social phenomenon that can change someone's information processing. So how they can get something wrong that is, has a very clear, objective answer. And usually we get it right all the time, but because of the social influence, we don't. So that's really when I got first interested in it. My whole journey beyond that kind of took a little bit of different paths, as I thought I wanted to be a clinical psychologist and a therapist for a while. And then I got really interested in neuroscience, and I did a couple internships studying brain science. So I applied to a neuroscience PhD program at the University of South Carolina, and I started doing quantitative neuroimaging, so fMRI work, really trying to analyze how we can understand what's going on in people's brains when they process different types of stimuli. So the technical term is neural decoding. So you put someone in the scanner, you have them think about an image or a picture or a sound, and you try to decode from their brain activity alone what type of image or sound they were thinking of while they're in the scanner. So I thought that was really cool. And then I realized to make a long story short, I realized I wanted to study people more instead of the neurons. So I kind of got back into social psychology and understanding how beliefs form. I was really interested in religious beliefs, political beliefs, all kinds of different beliefs that impact how people process their world and information. So that was 2015, 2016. So even before the rise of Donald Trump, when this whole concept of fake news became much more popularized in the media, I think for a couple years in a row, it was like Time Word of the Year, or like Dictionary.com Word of the Year, like misinformation, fake news. That was all like 2016, 2017. I was studying it a couple years before that. And it's been very interesting to then see this whole trajectory of misinformation become such a timely and topical and unfortunately prevalent aspect of our society and culture. And it's only been more amplified with COVID. I think with COVID, it made me want to take a more public presence, but I've been studying this for really specifically for 10 years, over 10 years now.
Now, Matthew, are you focused specifically on health and science misinformation, or more generally misinformation across disciplines and topics?
All types of misinformation. I have focused on health misinformation more. So when I was working as a postdoc at Vanderbilt University, I spent a lot of time thinking about health misinformation and vaccine misinformation, COVID misinformation. And there's a few chapters in my book devoted to health misinformation. But lately, I've been thinking about more global misinformation and media literacy. So
Interesting.
Kind of moved around a little bit.
And just as an aside, I actually kind of went on not the same, but a similar trajectory where I thought I was going to be a clinician. I don't know about specifically clinical psych, but although I did love my abnormal psych classes during college, and I actually worked in a neuroscience lab, and we focused on imaging, but it was different than what you're describing, but sort of a similar trajectory. And the thing that got me out of that was that I felt like I was missing a piece of the puzzle. You know, like the biochemistry of it all, while amazing and interesting, that's not what resonates most with me. And I'm very interested in that human psychological element. And I just recently actually put out a Substack newsletter on why I think some people are prone to wellness misinformation and health misinformation. And I'm curious if what you think about this, but I actually think it has a lot to do with control. And we all, of course, want to feel like we're in control of our health and that we could make meaningful changes that significantly impact the quality and quantity of our lives and the lives of our loved ones. And so the messages that resonate with us the most are those all or none, very absolutist statements that say, you know, X is going to cause cancer, or Y is going to add 10 years to your life. You know, they're palatable, they're actionable, they give people a sense of control. Whereas what I found when I put out my hyper nuanced posts that have all the caveats and all the, yes, well, this might increase your risk, but it's multifactorial and there's all these other factors. Those posts are never, you know, as popular because they're so gray. You know, they're not as actionable. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think when we consider our own health and mortality, it can be really scary. So if someone gives us an alternative that is much more comforting and simpler and gives us that sense of control, like anytime we can reduce uncertainty, I think as humans, we have a proclivity towards that, right? So if you say, okay, all you have to do is, you know, eat this specific diet, just, I don't know, eat walnuts and you'll have no more health problems. Then you're like, yes, I feel great. I'm in control and I'm going to, you know, live to be 150. Whereas, you know, like you said, the reality is a lot more complex and a lot more uncertain. And there's a lot of stuff outside our control, right? Like even if we do everything right, we still don't know a lot about how our bodies work and what causes all these illnesses. So it can be really scary to consider that. So I think that's spot on for sure.
And, you know, I'm guilty of previously sort of coming from a place of, I don't know, judgment, but, you know, people who buy into misinformation, especially when it comes to health and science. And in reality, I think I've come a long way to realize that there are so many factors that influence our susceptibility to misinformation, where, you know, we see the world through different lenses and, you know, different perspectives, and we have different upbringings and cultural influences and all the things. And I think, you know, what I love about the content that you put out is it acknowledges but leaves space for all those different factors that are influencing our susceptibility to misinformation and the way that we see the world. So on that topic, Matthew, why are some people more prone to misinformation?
Yeah, so I come at it from a perspective of identity theory. So my background in sociology and social psychology, I think a lot about identities and how identities guide us in our information processing. So to start out, like big picture, we all have these identities that like thousands of identities, like parent, brother, friend, worker, sports fan, all these types of identities, right? And they're going to influence how we process things. And when it comes to things like, again, if we're a sports fan, we might say, oh, that ref is biased and our team should win. Like, it's a pretty benign type of processing information in a biased way. But if we have a political identity, that can process our information in a biased way that might have more serious consequences, because ultimately what our identities do is they provide us with meaning and a sense of structure in our social worlds. And they also can provide a really strong sense of self-esteem. So we have this motivation to maintain consistency between the values of our identities and the environments that we're in. And so when we think big picture about why people believe misinformation, the perspective I often come from is a perspective of considering what identities are most important to that person and how those identities and set of identities are going to make them more vulnerable to certain types of misinformation. And we are all vulnerable to different types of misinformation. So that's kind of like the first big picture, is thinking about our identities. But even beyond that, there are more specific components that can predict a vulnerability to misinformation. The big ones are education and media information literacy. So when we think about just, aggregate studies of, okay, how do we, looking at this big population, what are the factors that predict higher susceptibility to misinformation? It's usually lower education, lower media literacy, and also stronger partisan beliefs. So those are kind of like the main drivers of specific individual factors that can predict misinformation susceptibility.
That's interesting. And also, I mean, you bring up this idea that we have, I think you said even thousands of different identities, right?
Sure.
And it's almost like at different points in time, different identities sort of take precedence. Like I know when I wear my scientist cap, I know, this is just one random example, that red dye is, we don't have robust human data showing that red dye is going to cause a variety of health outcomes that some people say it does, right? There's a lot of fear mongering around dyes and additives and such. But then when I put on my mother cap, right, I think about my two kids and I'm like, okay, I know the science is there. These things are safe from a scientific perspective and all the data are pointing to safe. But even still, my mama bear instinct, it's like, okay, but maybe I'll try to just minimize just in case, it's almost like I change the lens through which I'm seeing the world, right? And I'm placing a different emphasis on different things. So I wonder, I'm sure that's a factor in some of the models that you're assessing and you're considering, is that those different identities can shift and change over time, even in short periods of time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The technical term is identity salience. So that's how we talk about, like, what's more salient in your mind on this hierarchy. And it's always moving. And there's this interaction between salience and importance. So like trying to think what's more salient in your mind versus what has overall more importance. Another important factor as far as identities that I've been thinking about more is this concept of identity complexity. So basically what that means is, how much do all of your identities overlap with each other? So an example of really low social identity complexity is if you imagine all of your identities overlap on this perfect circle. So your religious identity, your political identity, your friend identity, they all align, they all agree with each other, and you can see the world through a very narrow lens because it all fits in this identity. Then you're very vulnerable to misinformation because everything is looking through that one lens, and all of your self-esteem is derived through this one way of looking through the world. Whereas if you have a higher social identity complexity and you have identities that don't overlap very much, then you're much more likely to see the world in a broader view and appreciate those shades of gray more, because they're not deriving so much self-esteem from a narrow set of overlapping identities. So the broader we can be, and there's studies that look at this, that when we have this higher social identity complexity, when we have broader set of identities, we tend to be less likely to fall for these types of misinformation.
And I'm sure it's also influencing the way that we're seeking out information. And then you add in like social media algorithm and all that. But like just recently I did a post on the way that we search for information, right? Just even the search terms that we use, and, confirmation bias, that's a whole other concept. But, if we're searching, does this cause cancer versus is this safe, for example,
absolutely,
that's going to spit out completely different information to us, and then also shape the information that we're exposed to and consuming. So just something else for people to be mindful of. So Matthew, sort of switching gears a little bit. So we're talking about susceptibility to misinformation, but what about the people who are putting out misinformation? Why might someone do that? And then maybe you could just help distinguish between misinformation and disinformation in terms of intentionality of deception.
Yeah, so misinformation is the broad umbrella term of any sort of information that's false or misleading, regardless of intent. So if you just share something on social media, you're not trying to mislead anyone, but it just turns out to be not true, that's a form of misinformation. Disinformation is intentional. So you're intentionally trying to mislead or deceive someone because of some goal. And, some of the easiest examples of this are with political misinformation and propaganda, where someone has a clear political agenda to, elect a certain person or a person from a particular political party. And that's why they want to share false information about their opponent, for example, because they want the other person to win. So disinformation is intentionally trying to mislead someone.
So, because I get the question, okay, what is the motivation? Why would a person lie about this? And to your point, sometimes they don't realize perhaps that what they're sharing is not, in fact, accurate information. But then, of course, there are unfortunately bad players who do, as you said, intentionally share disinformation. And the motivations, the two that always come to my mind are fame and fortune, right? So again, going back to how we sort of kicked off the episode, we know that those very absolutist or extreme statements, that's going to elicit a strong emotional response. It's likely to get people engaged with content, right? That's the stuff that makes a splash. It's clickbaity. And of course, large followings, although I have not cracked this code, they often translate to monetization, right? Like a lot of times you can, if you grow a large following, you develop a platform and you can make money from that. And then there's also just the fame aspect, the attention that people get, right? So any other thoughts or comments on why people might share mis or disinformation?
Yeah, money and power are huge drivers. They drive so many different things, right? And we can think about the disinformation campaigns. Ultimately, they're driven by money and power. And when we think about people who have, public platforms, again, like you say, more sensationalist, misleading content is an easy way to get more attention. So that's definitely some clear reasons why some people would share false or misleading content. And, I think about it as they might not start off even, with a goal to mislead people, but maybe they see one post does really well that was kind of sensationalized and they kind of drift more into that direction. And then all of a sudden they're, spreading complete lies and complete nonsense and justifying it. One other thing I'll say about why people share misinformation is it may be that they don't entirely believe it to be true, but they think by sharing it, it's better safe than sorry in some ways. So if they think, for example, all of this misinformation was spreading on WhatsApp in India and among these certain villages, you might have heard these stories. That was from a few years ago. And it was just rumors and lies about these people that were kidnapping children, and they were ultimately killed because of the misinformation being spread about them in these villages. And a lot of the misinformation spread on WhatsApp, just people just kind of forwarding these rumors. And some of the research looked at that as like, why did you reshare this? And some people said, well, I didn't know if it was true. I wasn't really sure, but I thought it was better to share this just in case there was a kidnapper in my village than to not share it. So when we think about other types of misinformation, it's kind of similar too. Like if you think that something's harmful, like, red dye or whatever, maybe you feel like that fear component of like, I think it's better to protect people I care about and share this just in case. And you're not really considering like the whole information environment of what happens when you do that. And you're just kind of having this fear response. So sometimes it does come from a place of protection and worry. So that's also something to consider.
I'm glad that you brought up that example from India. And I know you just attended this conference, right? The Social Media and Society conference, and you were sharing some really cool snippets on your threads. Is there anything in particular? I mean, well, I have some specific questions we can wait, but I know on the topic of why people put out misinformation, I think you quoted, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this person's name, Dr. Jimmy Narang's work.
I think so. Yeah. He brought that example about the WhatsApp groups.
I see. It almost feels, I don't know, I was at first when you were talking, it like felt almost like a Salem witch trial vibe, but I don't know. I mean, a little bit off track there. But I think there is something to that, to this tribal mentality. And I think sometimes it could be a protective element, as you said. Mm-hmm. I also think sometimes it's putting out information that you think will resonate with your tribe, right?
Yeah, that's also what I was going to say, yeah.
The sense of identity and belonging, right?
100%, yeah. So we think about identities as far as how they impact ourselves, but we can also think about how we interact with other people that share identities. Some of these terms that we could think about is, so when we support our identity, it's called identity verification. And then another term, when we interact with someone and we both support each other's identities, it's called mutual identity verification, because it's this mutual process of like, I share something that supports your identity, you like it, you share something that supports my identity, and we kind of reinforce each other. And yeah, in-group signaling is a huge part of it. Like, even if you don't think it's 100% true, you'd be like, you know what? I know people on my team are really going to like this. I'm going to get a bunch of likes if I post this. And that's definitely a motivation to share some misleading content, unfortunately.
You have me thinking, and I haven't really fleshed out this thought, but we're talking right now mainly about people consuming misinformation. But then I also think, I'm a science communicator, and there's a whole network of us who do science communication. And sometimes there's this like battle cry where it's like easy, you like rally the troops, and it's this sort of identity. There's something with identity there where it's almost like you're shaming the non-believers or the people who are prone to misinformation, like rallies the troops. I don't. Do you know what I'm not doing a very good job of articulating it. And again, I keep driving this home, but I'm doing my best to push back against that type of thinking and be more accepting of other perspectives, because I feel like by doing that, by this identity verification or seeking out this identity verification, it could actually be very exclusionary. And then like the work that we do to try to get through to people, and I think at least my main goal is to reach those who really would benefit most from science education. I feel like it has the opposite effect, and you're pushing them away by almost emphasizing differences in identities. Is that, is anything I'm saying making sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, no worries. I think, so a lot of the processes that I mentioned would apply to all types of different domains, right? It's not just politics. It's not just misinformation. It's just humans interacting in groups. We want to, signal our identities and feel community. To your larger point, I think about my own time doing activism, and from what I know about social movements and advocacy, there's a lot of different approaches to advocacy and outreach, right? And I think all of them, or a lot of them, are useful. I shouldn't say all of them, because that includes everything. But basically, there's different approaches. There's the more hardline, strident people who are really aggressive in how they approach content and how they want to engage with people. And then there's the bridge builders that want to have a bigger tent. And, I think there's a time and place for both of them, and people can do what resonates with their own strengths. Kind of a separate thing, but like I lived in the Deep South for a while as someone who doesn't align with a lot of the political ideologies of the Deep South. And what I found is, in order to help out with different forms of activism, I had to work with different groups of people that I didn't 100% agree with. And that was the only way we would be able to get things done in these states. So that's kind of the approach that I take. I take a more of a bridge building approach and trying to work with people, especially now in these current times. Like, it's really scary times when we think about the money and the power the disinformation machine has. I feel more comfortable trying to work with people and build bridges. I understand that people have different perspectives about that, but for me personally, that's just what I'm comfortable with. And again, it could be like a personality thing too. Like, that's just my personality. Sure. I try to get along with people, and that comes more naturally to me. But I think, I also can emphasize with like people who take this more hardline approach and try to really drive the conversation in a different way. It's just, I think lots of different forms of activism and outreach have their place.
I love that. I also love that there are these terms for these things that I have, like these amorphous ideas floating around in my brain. And you're like, oh, yes, that is this. We've studied this for years, and that is called this. I love that. So we're bridge builders, and I love that. But you're right. There's a time and a place for different forms of communication, and I respect that. All right. So in terms of media literacy tips, red flags of misinformation, can you help folks listening? What are some red flags that people should be aware of as sort of, warning, this might not be credible information?
Yeah. One of the biggest ones that I think about is trying to reflect on how the information makes you feel personally. Like, if it elevates your heart rate, you read a headline that makes you really angry or just really intense, to me, that's a warning flag, right? Because as we're, discussing there, so often there's a lot of information that is really complex, and the media has an incentive to sensationalize it to get us to click on it. And it may not make it 100% accurate because they want us to click on it and share it and get all that ad revenue. So that's like the first kind of really big thing, is just like, if we see something sensationalized, something that just makes us feel something really strongly, it could be true. There's a lot of things that warrant really strong emotion, but there's also a lot of manipulation and disinformation out there, like purposeful, like, hey, we're going to try to get people angry about something. And there's this, it might not be 100% based in truth. So that's really the big red flag that I have, is try to think about how it makes us feel. And that's something we can kind of personally check with ourselves.
And Matthew, remembering now, I think when we first got connected, I mentioned to you, we were trying to explore ways, because obviously we're both very passionate about this topic of misinformation and how to address it, prevent it. And I had mentioned, some sort of a media toolkit, if I'm remembering correctly. And it actually came up on last week's episode. I interviewed Moshe Wanunu, who runs Mo News, and he does it's more general news, not just on the topic of health and science. And we were talking, because he's been in this world of journalism and on this and that. And we were talking about the need for a toolkit for journalists and for media. But then you made a really great point, and I hope it's okay that I say this, but it's like, there's certainly a need for it, but how receptive how effective would it actually be? Because at the end of the day, people want those clicks. That's what's driving the industry. So it's almost like, would it be a futile effort, right?
Yeah, the people interested in that are probably already more careful with what they write anyway, So yeah, it's challenging. That's kind of like a big picture kind of issue when we talk about misinformation. It's always on this broader societal scale of like, all right, well, now we need to fix all the problems of society to really actually fix misinformation, which is obviously pretty challenging.
Yes, it is. That's an understatement. All right. So something else that you posted about that has been on my mind as well is the role or the potential role of artificial intelligence, of AI, in debunking misinformation. And you cited, and this I'm so deeply sorry, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but Dr. Sunandan Chakraborty. I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. I butchered that. But I'm curious because I guess you posted about that on Thread. So can you share a little bit about what you learned at that conference and some thinking about potential future directions for AI?
Yeah. So basically, he studies artificial intelligence and large language models, naturalistic language processing. And he was trying to look at how it applies to fact checks and if it can be used to facilitate fact checks and identify misinformation versus true information. It was interesting because he was actually asked if AI is ready to facilitate in detecting misinformation. He says no. To give a short answer, no, not yet, but we're getting there. So and that's common from other computer scientists that I have talked to. It's like AI is making a lot of great strides, but it's not perfect. There's tons of errors still, and it can facilitate fact checking and identify misinformation at better than chance, and in some cases pretty high accuracies in a more limited scope. But what he makes a point is that trying to identify misinformation with AI is going to require humans working with artificial intelligence. So, in part of this feedback loop, as you're training these models, you're going to have some humans helping along the way. You can't just push a button and be like, all right, we had this model, it's going to identify misinformation. Even if we ever get to a point where it can identify 100% accuracy, because of how rapid the information landscape changes, it's probably going to be out of date, pretty quickly. And maybe there's some new thing that we need a human to come in and be like, all right, well, this particular thing is actually false, even though it looks like it's true, and change the model that way. So basically, there's a lot of promise for artificial intelligence, but there's also a lot of limitations at this point. Some of the work that my colleagues at Notre Dame do is use artificial intelligence to identify if an image has been manipulated in some way. So this is something that can be really useful with AI because you're not trying to say is something true or false, but has it been manipulated? So if there's an image of a political figure that's clearly been photoshopped, our models can actually identify the original image and see what that looked like, and then compare it to subsequent pictures that have that Photoshop. So I think there's a lot of promise with AI using those types of detection techniques, and also just detecting artificial intelligence. I think it's also important to try to detect, if something was artificially created or not, and really try to determine authenticity as best we can. I think that's really going to be crucial moving forward, is as we have just this overwhelming amount of AI generated content, being able to determine, okay, this was from an original source versus this is something that was generated with AI.
Mm-hmm. It just has me thinking, wasn't that the whole thing with Princess Kate and the photoshopped image? It ended up right. We figured out anyway. That's a whole separate story. The conversation around AI, this is one we could chat about for hours, and maybe we could have a future conversation about that. But I'm sort of two minds. I know there are some people who are just sort of anti anything AI generated. I actually think that there is a role for AI. I think that AI can be a very powerful tool when used appropriately. But to your point, I think we're still sort of, it's rapidly growing, right? But I feel like we still have a ways to go, and there are some ethical considerations for sure. And, I've seen some demos of some interesting AI tools that are sort of being developed in this misinformation space. And it makes me think of, have you ever seen that show Lie to Me?
Yeah, was that from like a while ago? Like it was around TV.
Yeah.
I think I did watch that. Yeah,
Right, like
did it come back?
mid. Well, it's so funny. I'm on TikTok, and I guess some of the
Yeah.
old episodes are now getting, the snippets
Okay.
of
Yeah, I
it are
remember. I
making
think
the
I
rounds
watched
on
that
TikTok.
like what 20 years ago.
Okay,
Was it 20 years ago?
Make me feel old.
Sorry.
I don't know.
I mean, I feel old too mentioning that.
Well, no, but it has me thinking, because it's interesting that we really differentiated between misinformation and disinformation, because the way, I mean, there are some visual cues and the way that our voices move and the way, our mannerisms that could signal deception. But again, that's assuming intentionality to deceive, right? So I think a lot of the tools that I've seen, it's almost like lie detection, and also truth detection, which is very interesting. But again, it's sort of interesting because what if a person doesn't know that they're sharing bad information, right? So there's just a lot, I think, underway. Anyway, I'm curious to see how it all plays out with AI. I'm curious, just on a personal note, if there's a certain type of misinformation, just either generally or on a specific topic, that just grinds your gears the most, that really upsets you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, unfortunately. I mean, as far as a broad category, I think health misinformation is the one I'd have to pick because it has such dire and immediate consequences. We've seen that with COVID and the rejection of the vaccine. But, long before COVID, there's been all of these pseudoscientific practices for trying to treat serious illnesses. And then people end up dying because they try to take some alternative medicine that doesn't help them, and their illness progresses when it actually could have been treated. So those types of things really bother me because you immediately see the impact, and it's something that could have been preventable. And I mean, that's really frustrating to me. I mean, but just generally, seeing people profit off of overt lies and just complete pandering to their audiences. A lot of times this is political commentary, which is really frustrating. It's frustrating to me that politics and health are now just such blatant entertainment that it doesn't matter if you're wrong, because you just say, I don't like the other guy, and your fans all clamor and applaud. It doesn't matter what you say. You just say, I don't like that. And then that's what matters. So that's something that is very frustrating to me. And, going back to health misinformation, it was actually interesting that there was a recent meta-analysis that looked at the impact of fact-checking across different domains. And it was found that health misinformation was actually most resistant to fact checks. So, even more than
terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's another reason. It's such a difficult problem too. And there's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it now is, like the politics. And we talked about how political identities can bias us, and how if we want to believe something that, makes us feel like we are in control, or makes us feel better about ourselves, and someone says, no, that's wrong, it's really hard for them to change their mind. So yeah, definitely things with health, but all types of misinformation that has really immediate consequences to harming people is very frustrating.
There was another study, and I did not read it in its entirety to prepare for this at all. It just occurred to me, and tell me if you've heard of it, but it looked at the impact of political ideology on VAERS, so the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, and how in states that that lean more conservative, the number of reports to VAERS was significantly higher than those in other states. And sort of, I've talked about VAERS, at length, and just in case folks are new to it, it's a passive public health surveillance system for vaccines where people can report adverse events that they experienced after getting vaccinated. However, it's really used as an early warning system for public health scientists. If we see major trends, of a particular outcome, they're taken quite seriously and they're rigorously investigated to see if there are true safety signals or not. But unfortunately, I think COVID shined a light on VAERS, and people don't really understand that it cannot be used to signal causality, because just because something occurred after vaccination does not mean it was caused by vaccination. And also, some people do, unfortunately, intentionally file false reports of adverse events after vaccination. So it's a whole thing. But I thought that was really interesting. And we're all kind of aware of the role of political ideology in health and science information consumption, but we have not cracked that code. And I feel like that's a real area for future work. It breaks my heart to see certain friends and family members who do lean a certain way politically. They seem more likely to consume information specifically that paints like the government in a bad light, for example. Those who tend to have strong libertarian leanings automatically distrust, vaccines, for example, because the FDA is all bad, or they're, quote unquote, in bed with industry. So I find that those people are quite difficult to reach, but I have not given up yet. And I'm sure, I'm curious I'm sure you've seen that, and that's something that's on your radar as well.
The interaction between politics and health misinformation is huge, and definitely something I've studied. And, it's been unfortunate to see the rise of anti-vaccine misinformation align itself with right-wing politics. And it wasn't always the case. COVID really painted vaccination in a very partisan lens, unfortunately.
And I know I find it challenging. I mean, obviously, I'm unbiased science, right? But to put out nonpartisan information, again, this was something I talked about last week with Moshe. It's very difficult because science has been politicized, whether we like it or not. And so I feel like no matter what I say, it's construed as taking a political stance. And that's something that I personally struggle with quite a bit. So, Matthew, one more question, and then I'm going to leave you alone. But you posted something about the quantification of misinformation, and I believe it was Dr. Kiram Garamella's work in particular that you mentioned on Threads. I mean, as a data scientist, this is just something that I'm very curious about, how we quantify misinformation. Is there anything that you can share about that?
Yeah, so misinformation, as I mentioned, is such a broad term, and how we study it can be challenging because to do a good study, you have to define your variables well and code them in a way that makes sense with your statistical analyses. So sometimes you can't appreciate all of the nuance all of the time. And sometimes, things are changing, and what used to be misinformation may no longer be misinformation in the future. Like misinformation, it's based on the best available evidence we have. So that's kind of the bigger picture, but also just like how it's defined. Sometimes misinformation is defined as sharing links from non-reputable sources. So just any link from a source is kind of lumped in there. And that's done to make the experiment like the statistical analysis possible, because otherwise, if you try to go through each, like if you're looking at millions of tweets, for example, you can't parse through each one individually and fact check it. So you take a more generalized approach. Other research looks at specific statements of if something has been fact checked as true or false. So then you're defaulting to what fact checkers say. And there's other research looking at, broad beliefs that people have. So you talk about anti-vaccine beliefs, like that's a big component of misinformation. And that's why we see a lot of these links between conservatism and believing misinformation is when you just look at vaccine information, you see this very partisan slant. So it's really challenging to quantify, because you have to be very specific with how you came to those conclusions. And I think it's important for misinformation researchers to try to have as much humility as we can, and not try to come across as arbiters of truth. And I think it's tough because there are some things that we can feel very passionate about that are very there's a ton of science to support them, and we might just feel like this is clearly the way to go. And then there's some other things that maybe are less certain. And I think it's important to try to be mindful of our own limitations and how we, perceive our worlds and try to navigate different spaces and try to study misinformation, because ultimately the goal is to try to, have people live lives that are based in evidence and make evidence-based decisions and have people recognize their own biases. But as scientists, we have our own biases too. So I think it's really important to try to work together and determine consensus where we can call out each other's biases in order to all collectively become a little bit less biased.
Oh, I love that, Matthew. That was so beautiful. And honestly, it got me thinking, because as someone who has designed studies, it was melting my brain a little bit trying to think about how would I operationalize misinformation, because your study is only as good, as you said, as the variables that you select.
Right.
And of course, our goal is to capture misinformation. And what we're doing by figuring out how to measure that is we're coming up with a proxy for that, right? But as you said, we have our own biases. And I would even argue that a lot of misinformation is actually on a spectrum. And sometimes there are little seeds of truth, but then distortions or things are taken out of context. So I think it's quite challenging, but I think that's really interesting. It's something I'd love to talk more with you about. I think the work that you're doing is amazing. And as you said, I think we have a shared goal of helping people become informed consumers of information, in particular of health and science information. I think that when it comes to health, we all recognize that if you don't have health, you don't have anything, right? And if you've ever been sick or have dealt with chronic illness or have seen a loved one struggle, that becomes very, very blatantly obvious. And what kills me is when people prey on that vulnerability for whatever reason. And so, again, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Matthew, can you let folks know where they can find you and follow you on social media?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, Threads is the place where I'm most active on. I also have a public Facebook page, and I have a newsletter on my website, MatthewFacciani.com. That's the place where I share like bigger updates. Like when my book's finally out, I'll definitely be sharing that on my newsletter. But yeah, those are the places. My website and Threads are the places where people can find me most easily.
Awesome. Thank you again, Matthew. Do yourself a favor and follow Matthew. I'll be sure to include links to everything that Matthew just mentioned in our show notes. And thank you all for tuning in today, for following along with Unbiased Science. As you know, I regularly share infographics across all of the social media channels at Unbiased SciPod. There's also a weekly newsletter, which we deploy via Substack, and you can follow that at theunbiasedscipod.substack.com. Woof, that's a mouthful. Newsletters are always free. I don't put anything behind a paywall. There is a paid option if you are able and willing to provide some financial support. It's much appreciated. Please, the best way that you could support is by sharing word of Unbiased Science, letting folks know where to follow and listen in. If you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. And again, thank you all so much for your support, and I'll see you next week.